Okay, what if I told you that you could take the main ingredient in a can of toxic paint thinner and turn it into a sweet, fizzy, totally drinkable cherry soda? I know, it sounds completely impossible, right? Well, we're about to dive into the wild quest to do exactly that, and you're gonna see that chemistry has some pretty incredible tricks up its sleeve.
So how is this even remotely possible? Well, it all comes down to these two chemicals right here. On your left, you've got toluene. That's the key stuff in paint thinner, gives it that gasoline smell. And on the right, benzaldehyde. That's the chemical that gives us that classic artificial cherry flavor. Now here's the crazy part. Look at how similar they are. It is one tiny chemical tweak that separates a toxic solvent from a delicious treat.
So, the mission was clear, if not a little insane. Could you actually take industrial-grade toluene, put it through a chemical transformation, and end up with a soda that someone could actually drink?
All right, attempt number one. And let me tell you, it kicked off with a very, very toxic twist. This wasn't just mixing stuff in a beaker. This was serious, high-stakes chemistry where one little mistake could have, well, disastrous consequences.
The whole plan was built around this thing called the app² reaction, which uses a chemical called chromial chloride. And this stuff, it is no joke. We're talking toxic, carcinogenic, and super volatile. Even worse, the reaction itself creates a ton of heat. If you don't keep it constantly cooled, it can literally explode. The whole point was to carefully mix these super dangerous ingredients to create this brown sludge, an intermediate known as the app² complex.
So here's how it went down. First, the toluene gets diluted and the whole setup is sunk into this massive ice bath. Then, for hours, and I mean hours, the blood-red chromial chloride was dripped in drop by single drop just to keep the temperature from going crazy. And finally, just to make sure the reaction was totally finished and wouldn't cause any problems later, the whole dark, murky mixture was just left to stir overnight.
So after all that incredibly careful work, after hours of distillation and purification, the big moment finally arrived. The final oil was isolated. Was it that beautiful, sweet cherry flavor they were hoping for?
Nope, not even close. It was a complete and utter disaster. Instead of sweet cherries, the final product was something called benzyl chloride. And this stuff doesn't just smell bad, it's what's known as a lacrimatory agent. It's so good at making your eyes water that it was literally used as a tear gas in World War I. An absolute, total failure.
And that failure, it was so crushing, so demoralizing, that the entire project was just abandoned. It really seemed like that was the end of the road.
But then, 2 full years later, the motivation came back. And this time, it was with a new and, honestly, even more desperate strategy.
Okay, so the new plan really upped the ante. The decision was made to use carbon tetrachloride, a toxic, ozone-depleting solvent that's now banned for most things. But the biggest risk? The new plan was to isolate that app² complex directly. You know, that brown sludge that everyone in the textbook says is explosive. This time, every single chemical was also purified, leaving absolutely zero room for error.
This super high-risk approach, well, it led to a pretty desperate and completely unexpected breakthrough.
You know, the scariest part was supposed to be handling that explosive powder. So after all the anxiety, it was time for a test. A small amount was put on an anvil and hit with a hammer. The result? Absolutely nothing. No pop, no bang, not a thing. It was shockingly stable. So much for the legend of the explosive intermediate.
But that actually wasn't the real letdown. After all that work to successfully get a huge amount of the intermediate powder, which, by the way, even smelled a little bit like cherries, the next steps produced an absolutely pathetic amount. All that work, all that risk, for barely a single drop of the final product. It felt like another soul-crushing failure.
And at this point, you can't really blame him, right? After 2 years and 2 incredibly complex and failed attempts, that feeling was just overwhelming. It really felt like the project was cursed, and the thought of just giving up for good was very, very real. But then one last desperate what-if idea. The old procedures always said to add acid to help separate things, but that hadn't worked. So why not try the exact opposite? A base, sodium carbonate, was tossed into the mixture. Chemically, it made almost no sense, but somehow, magically, it worked. A huge layer of the yellow benzaldehyde oil just appeared. The project was saved right from the brink of death.
Finally, after all that, a taste of victory was in sight. With a good amount of the crude chemical finally secured, all that was left was to purify it and, at long last, actually make the soda.
Now, the The purification method they used was just incredibly clever. It uses something called a bisulfite adduct. The best way to think of it is like a chemical trap. When you add it to the impure oil, it's designed to grab onto only the benzaldehyde molecules, and it turns them into a solid. Everything else, especially that nasty tear gas, gets left behind as a liquid. It's a perfect way to separate them. The whole process was just genius. By creating this trap in water, it went in and selectively snagged all the benzaldehyde, turning it into a solid. This meant all the liquid junk, including that tear gas from the first failure, could just be washed away. Then, for the final step, you just add a base, which breaks the trap and releases the now incredibly pure cherry flavor. So after all of that, what does pure 100% benzaldehyde taste like on its own? It is horrible. I mean, it burns, it's bitter, it's just awful. But here's the magic, right? When you take that exact same chemical and dilute it properly in some carbonated sugar water, it becomes delicious. The final taste test for the soda? A solid 8 out of 10. The final result was a total success. The soda was completely indistinguishable from something you'd buy at a store. It was a perfect transformation from a toxic solvent into a tasty drink, and it just proves that with enough perseverance and a little bit of chemical magic, the things that seem impossible might not be. This whole journey really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If the only thing separating paint thinner from cherry soda is just a few atoms, what other incredible hidden connections are out there in the chemical world all around us? What other amazing transformations are just sitting there waiting to be discovered?